It is unexpected. It is dramatic, but I think it's all proceeding according to lines we could have roughly seen even before Christmas, a point at which Western officials were confident Putin did have a plan for an attack on Ukraine and that he was set on it and that its aim would be regime change. So I think this is still phase one. There's a temptation, I think, to believe that by recognizing these two breakaway republics that he has sort of finished his gambit. He has got what he wanted. He hasn't. By recognizing them, he has destroyed the Minsk agreements, which were his principal means of trying to get a constitutional veto over government decisions in Kiev. And he's put troops into Donbass. But of course, Russia has had troops there for 8 years covertly. So he hasn't got very much. But he's already incurred substantial cost. I've just heard, in fact, that Germany has suspended the certification of Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline. I think it is inevitable in the days ahead we will see Russia seek to expand control of the two territories' control. They only control a fraction of the territory in the Donbass region they lay claim to. And I think the fighting that results will provide a pretext for Russia to conduct wider strikes on Ukraine. That's my assessment. That's my prediction. It could be wrong, but I'm afraid so far this crisis has moved as I feared it would.
Yes, and we heard from his speech, which was sort of came out of the blue a little, despite weeks of negotiation and diplomatic negotiations. He made it very clear that he didn't even think Ukraine was a country and that it really belonged to Russia.
It was a frightening speech that sounded paranoid, perhaps even deranged to many people listening. But I would say that if you sort of look at it unemotionally and set aside the absurd theatrics of the speech, in this cavernous room with, delivering this to the two republics' leaders, it was stuff he said before. The principal themes were along the lines of an essay he published last summer on Ukraine, as you say, declaring that Ukraine wasn't a real state, didn't really have sovereignty apart from Russia, and of course had turned into this anti-Russian project fomented by the West. But I will say, if you listen to that speech in, for example, Finland, another former Russian possession that was lost by the Bolshevik government in the early 20th century, you'd be very worried, I think, as to what that said about Russian ambitions and Russian aspirations beyond just Ukraine.
Give us a sense of the military firepower of Russia compared to Ukraine and how well Ukraine could defend itself, because it's clear that there are not going to be Western forces sent in to help them.
Ukraine's army has come a long way since 2014. It's bigger, it has better Western arms, including thousands of anti-tank missiles sent in the last couple of months. The problem is that Russia's army is also better. It's improved substantially. It's fought in Syria, it's fought in eastern Ukraine, it's learnt all these lessons, it has had lots of spending lavished on it. And I think that with particularly Russian air supremacy, that the Ukrainians haven't got very good air defenses. The ones they have will probably be destroyed very quickly indeed. The Ukrainian Air Force will be effectively grounded. I think Russia will have command of the skies. It will be able to stop Ukrainian forces maneuvering around the battlefield to reinforce different areas. And Russia will be able to simply bypass big concentrations of Ukrainian forces when it needs to. And I think Ukraine's armed forces will suffer heavy casualties and they will not be able to withstand a Russian assault. Of course, that's not to say that Russia will be able to occupy Ukraine or large parts of eastern Ukraine without a very severe long-term consequences and partisan warfare. But Ukraine, in the early phases of this conflict, is going to lose.
So when you talk like that, how prolonged could this be once it escalates to its full level that he intends?
It depends on Russian aims. What Western security officials are still telling me is that they think a major attack on Ukraine is still the likeliest outcome, which would include a strike on Kiev. And indeed, both Boris Johnson and Joe Biden have openly said that in the last week alone. If that is the case, and if the Russian aim is to install a pro-Russian regime in Kiev and to change the orientation of the government, and on balance, I still think that is probably where we will end up. I think you could be looking at a long, difficult, bloody campaign that would be in the domain of years, not months.
And for the region, how destabilizing is this? I mean, it doesn't seem, as you pointed out, the Nord Stream pipeline seems to be now off the agenda. There are going to be crippling sanctions if the US and others follow. This could be very destabilizing for the region for some time.
Profoundly so. First of all, you're going to have Russian forces and NATO forces in close proximity in a very dangerous way. And there are people concerned about possible accidents, possible escalation. You'll have cyber activity that could spill out beyond Ukraine's borders. And beyond that, you'll have massive refugee flows into places like Poland and Romania. I think the polls have said they anticipate up to 1 million people flooding into their country. And we know how those refugee flows can have very destabilizing political consequences in Europe, as we saw back in 2015. NATO will have to reinforce its eastern front. It will have to make very large movements and reinforcements. Those are just some of the consequences I can imagine. There are many, many others. This is certainly going to be the most destabilizing act in European security for 25 years since the Balkan Wars. And I think it will probably exceed that conflict in terms of the scale and severity of the ramifications.
Shashank, appreciate your expertise. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.